I have no idea what's going on in St. Barts lately, but we have a plane that's crashed into a parked helicopter, and assessing that something happened to their brakes and they've now ended up here on the side of the runway, stuck, essentially shutting down the entire runway. Now, in fairness, I've never flown my 747 into St. Barts because it won't fit. But the airport has been there since the 80s, so it seems like all the kinks have probably been worked out. Let's see what happened in this video. As you know, St. Barts is not a normal airport because on one side of it you have a massive hill. And that means that when you're descending to land on this runway like these pilots are doing, they're doing it at about twice the normal descent rate. And notice that I said descent rate, not twice the normal speed. Because your rate of descent means you're needing to go down faster, and typically that's going to make your plane want to go faster, but you have to be able to go down faster without speeding up too much, so you prevent this from happening. You'll notice here at the start that the pilots are actually kind of far to the left of the runway, which doesn't really make any sense why they're doing that. But they do the right thing and correct to get to the middle. And it could be that the winds are different because in this mountainous area, sometimes you're going to have the winds are going different velocities and different strengths at different parts. So it could be that the wind was kind of strong there and that was what was pushing them, but you'll see what I mean in a minute. But these bars right here are where they should be touching down at. And it looks like right now they're about 5 feet off the ground, which normally would not be a big deal. But you'll notice when you look at this chart here is that the start of the runway where they're landing is at 48 feet above sea level, and it ends at 4 feet above sea level. Now that is not a normal thing. Most runways obviously tend to be flat. There are some that there's a bump or a hump or a dip or something small, but you typically aren't going to see that steep of a grade where the runway is getting away from you. However, here's the important thing to know. That's not a surprise. Everybody knows that that thing is graded. So these pilots went in there knowing that that was going to be one of the risks and probably talked about how to mitigate it. But right here, what they would have had to do is push the nose of the plane forward to get it onto the runway. And that is so counterintuitive. You've heard me talk about how many problems start by having the nose hit the ground first. The problem is that you want to have those mains hit before anything else. And so when the runway is going away from you, if you don't get the plane to go down to the runway, you're just going to keep floating over it. So instead of nosing the plane and getting onto the runway, they just keep at that same descent rate and they're not making any change. The speed starts to bleed off and they finally touch down, but they're more than halfway down the runway. And the problem is this runway is only 2,119 feet long, which is a very short runway to start with. And these bars, which are normally indicating you're 1,000 feet down the runway, obviously aren't 1,000 feet down the runway because that would put them right in the middle of the runway. Those bars, they are called all kinds of things, but that's where you're trying to get your plane to touch down on. And typically, on most every other airport you'll see, those bars are 1,000 feet down the runway, but you're not going to do that at a place like this because if you had about 1,000 feet down the runway, now you have 1,000 feet to stop, which is just not enough time to stop your plane. But all of that was fine. Here is where the problems really started. And I can't say for sure what happened, but it looks like they possibly stomped on the right brake. And they pushed on it so hard, it heated up the tire, causing a blowout. And then once the tire was blown out, the plane started going to the right. And with that tire going flat, the issue becomes that the plane loses rudder effectiveness. What that means is when your plane's moving really fast, there's a lot of air going over the rudder. And that allows you to turn your plane left or right. And your rudder on a plane like this is hooked up to your nose. Your nose wheel is going to be able to turn left or right with your plane. So that way when your plane's going slow, you can steer left or right. And when your plane's going fast, you can steer left or right with your nose. But the main thing that's adding the inputs is going to be on your rudder. When you're going really slow like that, your rudder is barely giving you anything and you really have to make heavy corrections because the steering wheel that's on the nose of the plane isn't going to pull hard enough to counteract that right wheel basically being flat and on the ground. Now, had the pilots been here when they had touched down, they would have been able to slow down at a normal speed and probably not have to get on the brakes so hard, which is just a guess of what happened. And it is strange that there's one side going and not the other, but sometimes what happens is pilots are foot dominant, and so they'll have one foot that presses on the brake harder than the other foot, and I'm guilty of that too. Our plane, it will give you a numerical readout based off of the brakes, so you can see which foot you're using more for your brakes. So you might see the pedals on the right-hand side, the brakes on that side of your plane are hotter than the one on your left-hand side, and unless you've been making a lot of turns where you're using that brake to help your turn, if that's not what's going on, then you'll say, oh, well, you're using the left brake a lot more or the right brake a lot more. So in some cases, if you're right foot dominant, you're going to be on your right brake too hard, and that may be what caused this, or it could have just been a lockup of that brake. I don't know. The other thing that wasn't really helping these pilots was this. Notice the windsock here, it's pretty lifeless. If that wind had been blowing on the nose of the plane, it would have slowed down the speed that they were covering the ground, meaning they would have touched down earlier on the runway. But because there's no wind pushing against the nose of the plane's going to fly forward a little bit farther, and then you get further down the runway, and then you get on the brakes more. Now, all of this would have been fine. I think they would have been able to stop. Well, they stopped, obviously, in 1,000 feet, which is really would give me a little bit of anxiety, but they were able to do it, and all would have been fine except for the part where they got off to the runway. Here, when they got just off the runway, if they had just made it to the turnoff, they would have been fine. They wouldn't have gone very far, but they would have avoided shutting down the entire runway. But what confuses me is, why would you be sitting there and then add a bunch of power? Now, I'm not 100% sure that that was them that revved the engine up, but I'm guessing that they were stuck there and thought, well, let's just get off of the runway. Now, you heard that engine speed up there for a second. Listen to this. I don't know if that's them. It's kind of hard to tell with the propeller if that was them or not. But either way, I don't think this is really a big deal. They're going to have a flat tire that they're going to have to change. I've blown tires out, and I would like to say that it was not my fault. The way the tire was being installed, the thing wasn't installed correctly, and the landing was actually really soft, and they were having a problem. This was years ago on a plane that I was flying, one of my first jobs. The mechanics were having an issue for some reason with a set of tires that they ordered, and they kept blowing out. So we kept trying to make the landings as soft as possible, but on one of them we were flying into Pittsburgh. We flew into Pittsburgh, we landed, and the tire blew. And it wasn't a big deal. We rolled off to the end, we got off the end of the runway, and then we had to call for maintenance to come up and tug us. Now here was the best part of this for me. I was still building flight hours. I still needed flight hours to be able to go to an airline. So I was just sitting there for like 45 minutes with the engines running until the maintenance people were able to come get us. We had to have the engines so we could have the radio so we could communicate with air traffic control. It was like the easiest 45 minutes of flight hours I've ever got. Either way, these pilots right here, I'm sure, are feeling very uncomfortable about it, but I'm positive they learned a very valuable lesson about managing their airspeed, and they'll probably never do this again, and they'll be better pilots for it. Okay, now this has really nothing to do with the plane incident itself, but it's just something that I've always heard and that you see down in the Caribbean, and that's like people are really chill, nothing bothers them, they're just like, yeah, no big deal. And this guy is a perfect example of that. Look at this guy, he's just like putting his helmet away, I don't know what kind of scooter he's on, and he's like, oh, a plane just crashed into a helicopter? Oh, crazy. Well, I don't want to be late for lunch, so. I mean, I kind of get it, you know that I love to eat, but anyway, this is kind of a tricky video because you can't see what happened from the point that they came in on the approach, which was kind of far away, but looked like overall everything was fine, it wasn't a big deal, and then they showed up basically at the plane. You can't really see what's in the middle, but obviously they were landing the other directions from those other pilots, so they don't really have the excuse of having the runway going away from them. It's actually going towards them. Now, I looked on a website, and I have no idea if this is true, but it says that the winds were 0 to 0 at 8 knots, which means they were coming from the right-hand side and pushing them to the left. To be clear, 8 knots is not a lot, not even on a small plane. 8 knots is something that pretty much every pilot at the very beginning phases, with like 50 hours or so, should be able to handle without any problems. 25 knots as a direct crosswind, okay, that's starting to be a lot. And now 40 knots, now you're starting to talk about planes getting pushed off the side of the runway. I've seen that, where the winds are so strong, if it's coming directly from the side, the plane will actually, especially on like a wide-body aircraft like a 747 or an A380, the plane will actually touch down. Some of the tires will get into the lights because there's such a heavy amount of wind that's pushing that way. It doesn't mean that it should happen, but that would make more sense than 8 knots. So if the plane's here, the wind is coming from the right here, so it's pushing them to the left. But the thing that's really interesting to me is that they would have had to make such a sharp turn to get past this parking lot right here and still hit the helicopters dead on. So they probably would have touched down, hopefully, right here, and then they had to get far enough forward to pass the parking lot, and then they had to get straight to the left in order to get to hit the helicopter. And of course, I'm just making an assumption here, which you're never supposed to do, but I'm making the assumption that they just missed the parking lot because I don't have any video from the parking lot, and the plane was going really fast and it seemed like everything was intact. So if that plane had run over several sets of cars, you would probably have seen some damage to the plane somewhere, and it didn't really look like there was any damage. It looks like it was full speed ahead, straight into the helicopter. Now it's possible they had an engine failure on touchdown, which I've had happen to me when I was flying a similar plane to this back in the day. We had a bird strike right on touchdown. They could have had a flat tire, like what you saw that other plane where it pulls them to the side, but at the speed they're going, their rudder would still be effective. So you would still get some ability to pull to stay at least on the grass. You'd be surprised to see how did it come in at such an angle that it missed the runway, went over the grass, around a parking lot, and into a helicopter. That is going to be an interesting one to explain, and I am glad I was not on that flight. Everybody, I guess, on the flight was fine, and the helicopter had nobody in it, which is really cool. But that would be a difficult one to explain to your chief pilot of how you got that far off. I've seen pilots where they've got it in the grass because of a strong crosswind, or they have an engine failure, or all kinds of different situations, and that's why it's grass there, and they don't have buildings right next to the runway because things like that happen, and I've seen that happen to pilots where it's not a big deal, they keep their job, and usually the plane's not really that damaged. This plane, like the wing came off, that's obviously going to be a problem. I look forward to hearing from you. Until then, keep the blue side up.